Alexander Sterling stood motionless behind the towering windows of his 42nd floor office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom he had conquered through sheer force of will and ruthless determination. The morning light cast sharp, unforgiving angles across his perfectly tailored Armani suit, highlighting the perpetual tension in his shoulders that never seemed to fade, no matter how many millions he earned or how many competitors he crushed. At 35, he had built Sterling Technologies from nothing more than a brilliant idea and borrowed capital into a billion-dollar empire that dominated the tech industry. But success had come at a price few understood, and even fewer would have been willing to pay. His reflection in the glass revealed not just a powerful CEO who graced magazine covers and commanded respect in boardrooms worldwide, but a man who had learned through painful experience to trust no one completely, expect absolute perfection from everyone in his orbit, and show mercy to none who disappointed him or failed to meet his impossibly high standards. The intercom on his pristine mahogany desk buzzed insistently, the sound cutting through the morning silence like a blade, reminding him that another assistant had likely already submitted their resignation and fled from his demanding presence. It was becoming a pattern he couldn't break, though he told himself with increasing defensiveness that he didn't care about the revolving door of employees who couldn't handle the pressure of working alongside greatness. Each departure confirmed what he had always suspected, that most people were weak, unreliable, and ultimately disposable in the grand scheme of building something truly extraordinary. The city below seemed to pulse with the energy of millions of people going about their ordinary lives, blissfully unaware that their digital existence depended largely on innovations that had emerged from his brilliant but isolated mind. Sarah Martinez, his 47th assistant in 24 grueling months, clutched her personal items against her chest as she hurried past the reception desk with barely controlled emotions. Her eyes red from tears she refused to shed in public but couldn't entirely suppress. She had lasted exactly 3 weeks and 2 days, longer than most of her predecessors, but still not nearly long enough to understand the complex, wounded man behind the impossible demands and casual cruelty that had become Alexander's trademark. The other employees throughout the executive floor watched her departure with a mixture of genuine sympathy and profound relief. Sympathy because they all knew Sarah was exceptionally talented, dedicated, and had genuinely tried to succeed in an impossible situation, and relief because it wasn't them walking away from what was technically the best-paying assistant position in the entire city. Alexander's reputation preceded him like a devastating storm cloud wherever he went in professional circles. Brilliant beyond question, ruthless in his pursuit of excellence, and utterly incapable of maintaining any relationship, whether professional or personal, that required even a fraction of emotional vulnerability or human understanding. His human resources director, Margaret Chen, watched the latest departure unfold with growing concern that was beginning to border on genuine panic, knowing that finding another qualified candidate willing to work directly for Alexander Sterling was becoming virtually impossible. Word had spread throughout the employment community about his impossible standards, his tendency to blame others for his own perfectionist frustrations, and his complete inability to show appreciation for even extraordinary effort. The best candidates were now declining interviews before they even met him, and those desperate enough to try rarely lasted more than a few days, before realizing that no amount of money was worth the psychological toll of working for someone who seemed determined to prove that everyone around him was inadequate. Margaret Chen spread the resignation letters across the polished mahogany conference table like evidence in a criminal case she was trying to build, each one telling essentially the same story of brilliant, capable minds being systematically driven away by impossible standards and casual cruelty disguised as professional rigor. The executive team sat in uncomfortable silence that stretched far longer than anyone found bearable, their concern growing more visible and urgent with each passing moment as they realized their company's continued success was being seriously threatened by one man's complete inability to connect with other human beings on any meaningful level. Alexander's behavior had become legendary throughout the corporate world, whispered about in industry circles as a cautionary tale of what happened when raw power and brilliant intellect consumed empathy entirely, leaving nothing but a hollow shell of ambition that destroyed everything it touched. His younger brother David, who served as chief operating officer and had watched Alexander's gradual transformation from driven entrepreneur to isolated tyrant with growing alarm, ran his hands through his prematurely graying hair as he contemplated the growing crisis they all faced. The company desperately needed Alexander's visionary leadership, his uncanny ability to anticipate market trends, and his revolutionary approach to technology development. But it also needed someone who could work alongside him without being psychologically destroyed in the process, someone who could somehow see past his carefully constructed armor to whatever remained of his humanity. The board members exchanged meaningful glances, all thinking the same unspoken question. How long could Sterling Technologies continue to thrive when its founder and CEO had become utterly toxic to everyone around him? The irony wasn't lost on any of them that Alexander had built a company dedicated to connecting people through technology, while systematically destroying every human connection in his own life, creating a personal wasteland that grew more desolate with each passing month. Elena Vasquez studied the job posting with the kind of careful, analytical attention most people reserved for legal documents or medical diagnoses, her intelligent dark eyes moving across each requirement and responsibility as if she were solving an intricate puzzle rather than simply considering another employment opportunity. At 28, she possessed an unusual and somewhat mysterious combination of advanced degrees in psychology and business administration, along with professional experience that most recruiters found impossible to categorize or fully understand, despite references that were absolutely impeccable. The employment agency had presented Sterling Technologies' executive assistant position to dozens of highly qualified candidates over the past several weeks, each one politely but firmly declining after researching Alexander Sterling's notorious reputation online and speaking with former employees who painted a consistently grim picture of working conditions. But Elena seemed genuinely intrigued by the challenge, rather than intimidated by the increasingly dire warnings about Alexander's impossible personality and destructive management style. Her professional background remained tantalizingly vague despite repeated inquiries, her previous employers describing her in glowing but mysteriously non-specific terms as someone who could handle impossible situations with remarkable grace, achieve results that bordered on miraculous, and maintain perfect composure under pressure that would crush most experienced professionals. When she finally looked up from the detailed job description, her expression held something the veteran recruiter had rarely seen when discussing this particular position: confident anticipation rather than the usual dread or desperate resignation. There was something in Elena's demeanor that suggested she not only understood exactly what she would be walking into, but had perhaps been preparing for precisely this kind of challenge her entire career, as if all her previous experience had been leading toward this moment of confronting an impossible man in an impossible situation. Elena stepped into the private elevator that led directly to Alexander's executive suite, her presence commanding subtle but unmistakable attention even in the confined space as the floors counted steadily upward toward what felt like her destiny. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal grey dress that managed to be simultaneously professional and subtly elegant. Her long, dark hair pulled back in a sophisticated style that revealed the determined set of her jaw and the sharp intelligence that sparkled in her expressive eyes. Unlike the dozens of hopeful assistants who had made this same nervous journey before her, she felt no anxiety whatsoever about the meeting ahead, no fear about the man whose reputation had become synonymous with impossible standards and systematic professional destruction of anyone who dared to work closely with him. Instead, she felt something that would have genuinely surprised Alexander had he known. Pure curiosity about what experiences had shaped him into the isolated, defensive figure he had become, and quiet confidence that she possessed exactly the right combination of skills, experience, and temperament needed to not only survive in his world, but potentially thrive there. The elevator's smooth ascent felt almost meditative, giving her time to center herself and review everything she had learned about Sterling Technologies and its enigmatic founder through her extensive research. She had studied his interviews, analyzed his business decisions, and even spoken discreetly with former employees who had been willing to share their experiences, building a comprehensive psychological profile that most people would have found deeply concerning, but that she found professionally fascinating. The elevator doors opened with a soft, expensive chime, revealing the pristine reception area where so many promising careers had begun with hope and ended in disappointment. But Elena felt only calm determination as she prepared to meet the man who had become her greatest professional challenge. Alexander looked up from his computer screen with the practiced expression of a man who had already decided to be disappointed, his cold blue eyes taking in Elena's composed appearance with the calculating, predatory assessment of someone who had learned to find fatal flaws in everyone who entered his carefully controlled domain. She stood in his doorway with perfect posture and unwavering eye contact, showing absolutely none of the nervous energy, eager to please desperation, or subtle intimidation that had characterized every single assistant candidate before her, and somehow that confident difference irritated him far more than any fumbling introduction or obvious anxiety could have. He had spent years perfecting the art of psychological intimidation through strategic use of silence, penetrating stares, and an atmosphere of barely contained impatience, using these weapons to reduce even seasoned executives to stammering uncertainty before they could disappoint him. But Elena simply waited with calm, patient attention that suggested she had all the time in the world and found his behavior mildly interesting rather than threatening or impressive. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the icy precision and subtle menace that had made countless employees reconsider their career choices and question their own competence. But she listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in understanding rather than merely surviving the encounter. The usual power dynamic he relied upon so heavily seemed mysteriously absent from the room, as if she were operating according to entirely different rules that he didn't recognize or understand. For the first time in years, Alexander felt slightly off balance in his own office, facing someone who seemed completely immune to the psychological tactics that had become his primary method of maintaining control over every professional interaction. "Your references are impressive, Miss Vasquez, but references don't prepare anyone for the reality of working here," Alexander said, his voice carrying the full weight of someone who had watched too many promising candidates crumble under pressure they couldn't have imagined in their worst nightmares. His words were carefully chosen to plant seeds of doubt and anxiety, the opening gambit in a psychological chess game he had never lost. Elena's response came without hesitation or defensive posturing, her voice remaining steady and professionally warm despite the obvious challenge and subtle threat in his tone, revealing a deep confidence that wasn't arrogance, but rather unshakable self-knowledge that had clearly been tested in ways he couldn't yet understand or appreciate. She outlined her extensive qualifications with precise detail that demonstrated not just basic competence, but genuine mastery of complex organizational systems. Yet she did so without the desperate edge that usually accompanied interviews in his office, as if she were simply stating verified facts rather than trying desperately to prove her worth to someone who had already decided she would fail. Alexander found himself listening more carefully than he had in months, not because her credentials were exceptional, though they certainly were, but because her entire demeanor suggested someone who genuinely understood exactly what she was signing up for and had made a conscious, informed choice to proceed anyway. Her calm professionalism felt almost aggressive in its completeness, a direct challenge to his assumption that everyone who entered his orbit would eventually be broken by the experience. For the first time in years, he felt something approaching genuine curiosity about another human being, though he immediately suppressed the feeling as a dangerous weakness that could only lead to disappointment and betrayal. Elena's first week at Sterling Technologies unfolded like a masterclass in professional excellence that left even Alexander's harshest critics impressed and slightly bewildered by her seemingly effortless competence. Each day revealed new layers of ability that went far beyond what anyone had expected from an executive assistant, no matter how qualified. She anticipated Alexander's needs with an almost supernatural intuition that bordered on mind reading, managed his notoriously impossible schedule with the efficiency and precision of a Swiss timepiece, and handled his deliberately harsh criticism and unreasonable demands with a calm that seemed to frustrate him more than any emotional reaction or defensive response ever could. Unlike all her predecessors, she didn't try to win his approval through flattery or attempt to soften his harsh edges through emotional manipulation or personal charm. Instead, she simply performed her duties with such remarkable skill and unflappable composure that his usual complaints seemed petty and unfounded, leaving him in the completely unfamiliar position of having nothing legitimate to criticize, despite his strong desire to find fault with her performance. Her presence throughout the executive floor created a subtle but unmistakable shift in the entire office atmosphere, as other employees began to relax slightly for the first time in months, sensing that someone had finally found a way to work successfully alongside their notoriously difficult CEO without being destroyed in the process. The change was almost imperceptible at first, but gradually became more obvious as people stopped walking on eggshells and began focusing on their actual work rather than simply trying to avoid Alexander's attention. Alexander watched her navigate his complex, demanding world with growing confusion and irritation, completely unable to understand how she remained utterly unaffected by psychological tactics that had successfully broken dozens of intelligent, capable people before her. As the weeks passed with unprecedented smoothness, Alexander found himself staying later at the office, not because his workload had increased or his demands had become more urgent, but because he had become genuinely fascinated by Elena's seemingly effortless mastery of tasks that had consistently overwhelmed every assistant before her. She handled sensitive international calls with perfect linguistic fluency in multiple languages, managed complex negotiations with diplomatic skill that impressed even seasoned executives with decades of experience, and somehow maintained detailed, accurate knowledge of every project across his vast corporate empire without ever appearing rushed, overwhelmed, or confused by the sheer volume of information she processed daily. Her professional background remained mysteriously vague, despite his increasingly discreet but persistent inquiries. Her previous experience described in frustratingly general terms that suggested significant responsibility and impressive results, without revealing specific details about companies, positions, or the exact nature of her expertise. He began to suspect that she was far more qualified and experienced than any executive assistant position could possibly require. But she showed no signs of resentment about being underutilized or any ambition to leverage her obvious abilities into a more prestigious role. When he deployed his usual intimidation tactics, unreasonable deadlines delivered with deliberate cruelty, impossible demands designed to provoke failure, and intentionally rude behavior meant to establish dominance, she responded with such consistent professional competence that his behavior appeared childish and petty rather than authoritative and demanding. This realization both frustrated and intrigued him in ways he couldn't entirely understand or comfortably acknowledge, forcing him to confront the possibility that his management style might actually be counterproductive rather than effectively challenging. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult and contentious board meeting, when several major investors questioned Alexander's leadership style and its increasingly obvious negative impact on company morale, employee retention, and overall organizational effectiveness. Their concerns were voiced with the kind of direct, uncompromising honesty that usually triggered his most defensive and aggressive responses, turning routine business discussions into personal battlegrounds where he felt compelled to prove his superiority through intellectual domination and emotional intimidation. Elena sat quietly in the corner throughout the heated discussion, taking detailed notes with her usual focused efficiency. But when the meeting finally ended and the boardroom slowly emptied of frustrated executives and concerned investors, she approached him with something he had never experienced from any employee in his entire career: genuine concern rather than fear, anger, or the calculated sympathy of someone trying to manipulate him for personal advantage. She didn't offer meaningless platitudes or false reassurance designed to make him feel better about the valid criticisms he had just received. Instead, she spoke with quiet, thoughtful honesty about what she had observed in his interactions with colleagues, employees, and business partners, her words carrying the weight of someone who understood both the importance of strength in leadership and its dangerous potential for self-destruction when taken to unhealthy extremes. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself actually listening to criticism without immediately planning his counterattack or building his defensive arguments, her insight somehow penetrating psychological defenses he had spent decades carefully constructing and maintained at enormous personal cost. The conversation lasted well into the evening, marked by long, surprisingly comfortable silences that felt more meaningful than the countless meetings he had endured with people eager to tell him exactly what they thought he wanted to hear. "You don't have to do this alone," Elena said quietly as they sat across from each other in the small, intimate restaurant she had suggested, far removed from the usual corporate dining establishments where Alexander's every move was observed and analyzed by competitors, colleagues, and industry journalists looking for insights into his business strategies or personal life. She had proposed dinner as a practical discussion about several upcoming projects that required careful coordination, but somehow their conversation had naturally evolved into something neither had anticipated or planned, touching on subjects Alexander hadn't discussed with anyone in years, if ever. He found himself talking openly about the early days of building Sterling Technologies from nothing, the series of personal and professional betrayals that had taught him to trust no one completely, and the gradual but inexorable isolation that had become both his psychological protection and his emotional prison. The words came surprisingly easily when he realized Elena was actually listening without judgment, hidden agenda, or the calculating assessment that characterized most of his interactions with other people. Elena shared carefully chosen fragments of her own story, enough to reveal impressive depth and complexity without surrendering all her intriguing mysteries. And he began to understand that her unusual calm and unshakable composure came from having survived significant challenges that would have broken most people completely. Her past clearly included experiences that had tested her in ways that made dealing with his difficult personality seem almost manageable by comparison, though she spoke about hardship with matter-of-fact acceptance rather than self-pity or desire for sympathy. The evening stretched far beyond any conceivable professional necessity, gradually becoming something that felt dangerously like genuine friendship. A connection Alexander had convinced himself he neither needed nor wanted, but found himself craving despite all his careful defenses. The changes in Alexander's behavior started almost imperceptibly, but grew increasingly noticeable as Elena's influence gradually permeated not just his immediate work environment, but his entire approach to leadership and human interaction throughout the company. Employees who had walked on eggshells for months, constantly afraid of triggering his unpredictable anger or harsh criticism, began to breathe more easily as his impossible standards slowly evolved into challenging but actually achievable expectations, and his cutting remarks were gradually replaced by direct but constructive feedback that genuinely helped people improve, rather than simply crushing their confidence and motivation. Elena never lectured him about his behavior or demanded changes directly through confrontation or ultimatums. Instead, she consistently demonstrated through her own actions and responses how real strength could coexist peacefully with kindness, how genuinely high standards didn't require cruelty or intimidation to be effective, and how authentic respect based on competence and fairness could motivate people far more effectively than fear ever could. Alexander found himself asking for her opinion on decisions that went far beyond any assistant's typical responsibilities, valuing her insights not just for their practical wisdom and strategic intelligence, but for the ethical foundation that seemed to guide every recommendation she made. Her moral compass appeared to be as precisely calibrated as her professional skills, helping him navigate complex situations with consideration for all stakeholders rather than just his own interests and ego. The company culture began shifting in ways that impressed industry observers and absolutely delighted employees who had never expected to actually enjoy working for Sterling Technologies, transforming the organization from a high-pressure environment characterized by fear and anxiety into a genuinely collaborative workplace where excellence was pursued through mutual respect rather than intimidation and psychological manipulation. On the company's rooftop garden, surrounded by carefully tended plants and the glittering city lights that had once symbolized nothing more than his personal conquest, but now felt more like a shared vista representing possibilities he had never considered, Alexander finally understood what had been happening to him over the past several months, as Elena's quiet presence had systematically dismantled every defensive wall he had spent his adult life constructing around his heart and soul. The realization struck him with surprising gentleness, rather than the terror he might have expected, that he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with the woman who had challenged him professionally, supported him personally, and somehow managed to see past his carefully cultivated reputation as an impossible perfectionist to whatever remained of his authentic, vulnerable self beneath all the armor and aggressive posturing. Elena stood beside him in comfortable silence, her face turned upward toward the stars, as if she were reading ancient secrets written in constellations. And when she finally looked at him with those intelligent, compassionate eyes, Her expression held the same recognition and wonder that he was feeling, the acknowledgement that their professional relationship had evolved into something infinitely more precious and terrifying than either had planned or expected. "I never thought I was capable of this," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of years of self-imposed isolation and emotional numbness. And her smile in response held all the warmth, acceptance, and genuine affection he had never dared to hope for. The vulnerability of the moment felt both frightening and liberating, as if he were finally allowing someone to see him completely without his usual masks and defenses. Trusting that she would handle his heart with the same care and competence she brought to everything else in her remarkable life. 6 months later, the executive suite at Sterling Technologies hummed with an energy that none of the long-term employees could have imagined possible during the dark days of Alexander's isolation and hostility. The entire space transformed from a psychological battlefield into a genuinely collaborative environment where excellence and humanity coexisted in perfect productive harmony. Elena had accepted Alexander's heartfelt proposal not just for marriage, but for true partnership in every sense of the word, becoming Chief Operating Officer in formal recognition of abilities that had always far exceeded any assistant position. Her mysteriously vague background finally revealed as extensive experience in corporate turnaround and organizational psychology that she had applied with surgical precision to heal his wounded company culture. Their love story had become something of a legend throughout the business community, discussed not as a simple fairy tale of romance conquering all obstacles, but as a powerful, inspiring example of how two strong, accomplished people could choose to become even stronger together while maintaining their individual identities, professional excellence, and personal integrity. Alexander still demanded high standards, and Elena still challenged conventional wisdom whenever she encountered it. But they had learned to channel their formidable combined abilities toward building something greater and more meaningful than either could have achieved alone. The company flourished under their joint leadership, attracting top talent who were drawn not just by competitive salaries and cutting-edge projects, but by the opportunity to work in an environment where professional excellence was pursued through collaboration rather than fear, where innovation was encouraged rather than stifled by perfectionist anxiety, and where every employee was treated with the respect and consideration that allowed them to do their best work. The arrogant billionaire who couldn't keep anyone in his life had finally found someone worth keeping forever, someone who had seen through his defenses to the lonely, wounded man beneath and had chosen to love him not despite his flaws, but because she understood that his greatest weaknesses and greatest strengths were often the same qualities viewed from different angles, and that with the right partner, even the most damaged heart could learn to trust and love again. Thank you so much for listening to our story about Alexander and Elena, and how love can find us even when we think we're too broken, too strong, or too set in our ways to need anyone else in our lives. We hope their journey touched your heart and reminded you that the right person can help us become the best version of ourselves, without asking us to lose what makes us unique and valuable. Please take a moment to write in the comments and let us know where you're listening from. We love connecting with our amazing audience from all around the world and hearing how these stories resonate with your own experiences, dreams, and beliefs about love, redemption, and second chances.